General Motors is taking a hit today after reporting a 40% drop in profit in the second quarter as supply chain constraints due to the ongoing chip shortage and price hikes pumped the brakes on production. CEO Mary Barra says the automaker is already taking proactive steps to prepare for ongoing economic headwinds. Joining us now to discuss is Wedbush analyst Dan Ives, along with Yahoo Finance senior auto correspondent Praz Subramanian. Dan, this outlook, I think, is really in focus here on General Motors, very optimistic. Do you think against this recessionary backdrop, General Motors is missing the point here and they should have came out here and cut guidance?
I think there's a lot of skepticism on the street because it starts to be the boy that cried wolf in terms of hitting numbers. And I think that's the frustration here, is that the strategy is outlaid for the coming years. And I think it could be significant in terms of EVs. But every quarter has been one stumble after the other. And I think you're starting to get into, it's not just talking the talk, it's walking the walk. And this is a pivotal 6 months ahead for Mary and the team.
Hey, Dan, Praz here. Do you think that the strategy, it sounds like you're saying that it's a little bit too late, right? With all these big three models, Silverado EV, Trailblazer or Blazer EV, as well as the Equinox coming next year. Is that going to be a problem for them? Is it too little too late?
Look, I don't think it's too little too late. Where we are in EVs, it's still first, second inning. I mean, outside of Tesla, if you look from a percentage perspective, we're going to have trillions spent on EVs. But for GM, it's so important going into the next year, especially the 100+ automakers going after EVs, no more stumbles. Supply chain, okay, some of that stuff's out of the control, but they need to lay out the path to make sure, especially when we get to Cadillac Lyriq, Hummer, you get the Silverado and others, that they don't sort of fall off. Because look at Ford, look at others across the board. This is really going to get more and more competitive. And I think that's the frustration here. It's like the pilot continuing to tell you you're about to take off, and it's an hour and a half later, you're still on the runway.
Dan, for me, this continues to come back to the battery. Tesla spent a lot of time talking about the battery and what some of that new formulation is going to look like going forward in its earnings. GM similarly announcing some of the partnerships that are going to help them support the core materials or get the core materials in order to put the battery together for a lot of their EV ambitions. At the end of the day, how quickly can they ramp up this battery going into production and then it actually showing up in deliveries that have been decelerating?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's when you look at Ultium and you look at the strategy here, that's really the hearts and lungs of the GM vision. When we look out over the next decade, it's why I believe it is a bit maybe glass half full for what could happen. Multiple could continue to move higher, growth could go further up, but they have to execute. You're talking about an install base where they're selling 7.5 million cars a year, but you got to execute and you cannot continue to delay that strategy. I think going further down the chain, securing from a raw material supply chain is very important. I think you're seeing Farley and Ford do the same because it's an EV arms race right now. But it goes back to a year from now. This is either starts the massive path to success or stumbles. And I think investors really start to throw in the towel. And that's why there's a pivotal, really 6 to 9 months ahead for Mary and the team.
Hey, Dan, speaking of Mary, she was pretty vocal about preparing for the worst in the shareholder deck letter that she had out. What's your take on that? Do you think it's sort of is it something that's sort of affecting your modeling when you go through with your GM story?
Well, I think you'd rather them be prudent. And kind of Brian's question, I'd rather them be cautious because then investors don't feel like they've set themselves up for just more, negative expectations as we go into 3Q and 4Q. But right now they got to maintain, if you look at margins, margins got hit, right? You're starting to see incremental expenses come through, softer macro. So I think they're definitely prepared for that. But it comes down to you can't cut your way to growth. So it all comes down to just making sure from a delivery perspective, from the battery technology and getting those models out on time. That's really what the street's going to be focused on in terms of what's going to drive the stock.
Dan, while we have you, just want to pivot to some of the other big companies you cover because they're yet to report. And in particular, I'm focused on Microsoft and Apple in your coverage universe because we're about to hear from them. Is there one or the other that you're sort of more excited about or that you would be pounding the table on going into the numbers?
Look, I think there's a theme that's starting to develop here in tech earnings. It's better than fear. And I think when it comes to Microsoft, the world's going to be watching because it's the best barometer that you have for enterprise spend, especially cloud. I think cloud's held up better than feared. And I think that's going to be important, especially in terms of that Azure number, call it a mid 40% number, 45, 46% growth. They'll be cautious a bit, and that's expected. But I believe the combo of Microsoft as well as Apple, what we're seeing on the supply chain in terms of, especially in the drum roll to iPhone 14, I think these are the two most important earnings reports throughout earnings season in terms of what's telling you across enterprise, across consumer, as well as zero COVID that we're seeing in China.
Dan, I was in the same court with regard to Microsoft being a bellwether earlier this week when we were talking about that. And so thank you for reassuring some of my confidence here on the day. Dan Ives, Wedbush, Managing Director and Senior Equity Analyst, and our own Superman, joining us here to discuss all things GM, auto landscape, and tech.